It was the kind of night that felt like a wet, heavy blanket, stifling every breath, every thought. The road was a ribbon of darkness stretched out before me, and I cursed my luck for taking this desolate route. The gas gauge had been flirting with empty for miles, but I had hoped to push through, just this once, and make it home before the needle dipped below red. But here I was, stranded, the engine coughing its last breath in the middle of nowhere. The silence that followed was almost mocking, the sort of quiet that presses in on your ears until you start to hear things you don't want to hear. I was barely 18, and still foolish enough to think that the world could be as forgiving as it was dangerous. I waited by the car, the headlights casting weak beams that barely pierced the inky darkness. Time seemed to stretch out in that void, every minute feeling like an hour, until the distant rumble of an engine broke the stillness. Relief washed over me as an old sedan pulled up, the driver a man with a too-wide grin leaning out to offer help. His eyes had a gleam that didn't sit right with me, but what choice did I have? He said he'd take me to the nearest gas station, just a couple of miles up the road. The inside of the car smelled like old cigarettes and sweat, the kind of odor that sticks to the back of your throat and makes you feel dirty just by breathing it in. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. But then I heard a low, muffled thump coming from the trunk. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just the car's ancient suspension groaning under the weight of time. But then it came again, this time accompanied by a faint, almost human sound, a whimper, maybe. My stomach twisted into a knot, and my heart began to race. I stole a glance at the driver, but he was focused on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. I couldn't tell if he had heard it too, or if he was just pretending not to notice. Each thump, each barely audible cry seemed to grow louder, echoing in my head until I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. I had to get away. But how? The man's grin had vanished, replaced by a blank, almost robotic expression, as if he had turned off some part of himself that might have once been human. I waited, hoping, praying for a red light, for anything that would give me a chance to escape. And then, as if the universe had taken pity on me, the car slowed to a stop at a red light. The moment the car stilled, I threw open the door and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The road was a blur beneath my feet as I sprinted toward the faint glow of neon in the distance, a diner, its flickering sign a beacon in the night. I burst through the door, breathless and frantic, and collapsed into the arms of a startled waitress. I told them everything, the words tumbling out in a jumbled mess as they called the police. The officers arrived, their lights cutting through the darkness, and I watched from the safety of the diner as they approached the car. My heart was pounding, each beat a reminder that I had made it, that I had escaped. But as they opened the trunk, I turned away, unable to bear what they might find. I never did find out who or what was in that trunk. The police told me they'd handle it, that I didn't need to worry. But I did worry. I worried every time I closed my eyes and heard that thumping sound, every time I found myself on an empty road at night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had nearly swallowed me whole, and that somewhere out there, it was still waiting, hungry for another chance. It was late at night, the kind of night where the air felt too thick, and the silence seemed to press against your ears. I was 18, stranded on a deserted stretch of road in Uvalde, Texas, the summer heat still hanging in the air like a heavy, oppressive shroud. My gas gauge had been flirting with empty for too long, and finally, it had given up on me. I tried my cell phone, but the signal was as dead as the road I was stuck on. The minutes dragged on, each one stretching into an eternity, my frustration bubbling up with every passing second. That's when I saw a truck with its headlights off, rolling up behind me like something out of a bad dream. The headlights flicked on just before it came to a halt, casting an eerie glow over the cracked asphalt. I stepped out of my truck, trying to act calm despite the gnawing fear in my gut. The man who emerged from the truck was tall and lean, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He moved like a predator, slow and deliberate. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to scratch at my nerves. I should have said no, I should have turned around and gotten back in my truck, but the sheer desperation made me nod. He started towards me, but something in his eyes, a glint of something that wasn't quite right, set my skin crawling. "Actually," he said, his smile widening in a way that felt more like a sneer, "I think I'll take your stuff." He reached out, his hand like a claw, and suddenly everything fell into place. The off headlights, the creepy smile, the way he'd been looking at me from the start. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave. I turned and sprinted for the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him calling out, but I didn't stop. I dove into the darkness of the woods, branches clawing at my skin, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. I hid until dawn, shivering with cold and fear, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves making me jump. When I finally emerged, the sun was just a pale light on the horizon, promising a new day, but not easing the dread that had settled in my bones. Back at my truck, the glove box was empty, my items gone. The sense of violation was suffocating, each missing item a reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. As I drove away, the road stretched out before me like a snake, and I swore I'd never let my tank run low again. The darkness of that night had taught me a brutal lesson out here. In the endless night, danger lurks just beyond the edge of the headlights. I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled out of the gas station. The air felt too thick, too heavy for a night in Burke County. My car, an old Buick that had seen better days, coughed and sputtered like an asthmatic smoker. I had just filled the tank, watched the numbers climb to even $20, and yet, not 2 miles down the road, the needle on the gauge dipped ominously toward empty. I pulled over, the Buick lurching to a halt on the side of the road. The trees stood tall and shadowed around me, the moon barely piercing through their thick branches. The road was deserted, the kind of deserted that makes you wonder if you've crossed into another world. I stepped out, my feet crunching on the gravel, and opened the hood. I'm no mechanic, but even I could see the fuel line wasn't just leaking, it had been cut. Deliberate, precise, like a surgeon with a scalpel. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had done this, someone back at that gas station. I thought back to the man behind the counter, his eyes watching me with a strange intensity as I paid for the gas. He hadn't smiled, hadn't even nodded in acknowledgement, just stared with that unsettling gaze. I brushed it off then, but now, standing in the dark with my car crippled, I felt a chill creep down my spine. Before I could decide my next move, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing brighter and closer. My breath caught in my throat as the car pulled up beside mine, its engine purring smoothly, a stark contrast to the wheezing death rattle of my Buick. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a man with a too-wide smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. He offered help and said he had a house just down the road, tools that could fix me up in no time. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to thank him and wait for someone else, anyone else. But the darkness pressed in, and the isolation weighed heavy, and against my better judgment, I agreed. I climbed into his car, the leather seats cool against my legs, and we drove in silence. His house was close, a small, run-down place that seemed to sag under the weight of the night. He led me inside and offered me a glass of water. I took it, out of politeness more than anything, but I didn't drink. Something about the way he watched me, his eyes never leaving mine, made my skin crawl. He fiddled with something on the counter, his back turned to me, and that's when I noticed it, just the smallest flick of his wrist, dropping something into the other glass, the one he'd intended for me. I didn't need to see more. I put down the glass and made an excuse about needing to get back to my car, my husband waiting for me. His smile faltered just for a moment, and that was enough. I turned on my heel and walked out, my pace steady, resisting the urge to run until I was out of his sight. I was halfway back to my car when I saw headlights again, but this time it was a familiar sight, my husband's truck, a beacon in the darkness. Relief washed over me as I flagged him down, my hands trembling. We didn't speak as we walked back to the Buick, both of us noticing at the same time the fresh gouges in the paint, the slashed tires, the undeniable evidence that I had been targeted. My husband checked under the hood, confirming what I already knew: the fuel line had been cut clean through. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened window, replaying the events over and over in my mind. The man's face haunted me, his too wide smile, his watchful eyes, the casual way he had tried to slip something into my drink. I kept thinking about what could have happened, what almost did. It took days for the terror to fade, but the unease never left, not entirely. I still jump at shadows and flinch at the sound of footsteps behind me. Burke County, that quiet, sleepy place, had turned into a landscape of fear, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still out there, watching, waiting.